thank you again for joining us. We're very happy to have you with us, and your expertise and knowledge on Malik Ambar will add a lot of value to our audience. So jumping into Malik Ambar's life,
Yes.
but if it's possible, Ro, can you give us a brief 2 3 minutes overview of who was Malik Ambar, why is he so important?
I would be delighted to. Yes. So Malik Ambar was born in approximately 1548, so in the mid 16th century, in the area of Hararge in Ethiopia, and he was born into an Oromo family. So Oromo are one of the largest ethnic groups in the country, and sometime in his youth, he was enslaved. Most likely was sort of caught in sort of the crossfires of the fights that were going on between Muslim Ethiopians of part of the Adal Sultanate and those that were Christian in the highlands. And there was battles going on, and the Oromo peoples were in some ways squeezed into this. And he was captured probably sometime in his early youth, and then taken to Mocha in southern Arabia, and from there either went up the Red Sea and then on to Baghdad, or went around to the Persian Gulf. But he left behind his family, his culture, his people, his where he had grown up. But he brought with him, obviously, language, his own physical body, and probably cultural elements into where he ended up going. And he traveled a great deal. He was in Baghdad, where his master, because he was enslaved, gave him an education, and he was trained in business affairs and worked with him in Baghdad, which was essentially a cosmopolitan city. It was not the Baghdad of the Golden Age, but it was still a major city in the world. And from there, he was taken to India as part of the military slave system across the Indian Ocean world, and was sold to another Abyssinian, which is the older name for people from Ethiopia, who took him as part of his army. And so it's interesting to note that, he was taken across the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, to India to be purchased by a fellow African. And he was taken under the wing of this other Abyssinian, who was a prime minister in one of the sultanates there, and over about 25 years becomes a ruler in his own right. So Malik Ambar will be a mercenary general and essentially take hold of the Sultanate of Ahmednagar, which is in the central area of India, in the Deccan. And his legacy is having kept the Mughals, that is the Muslim imperial forces from the northern part of India, from taking over the Deccan. And he did that through a combination of extraordinary diplomatic skills, guerrilla warfare, administration, political savvy, and was able to keep that region of the Deccan in India free of a Mughal rule for a quarter century. And so in that time, he had construction projects that exist today. And he, in fact, his children, he married there into not a local family, but actually a woman of Ethiopian descent as well. But his family itself would be married into some of the royalty. And so he is perhaps the best example that we have of this African presence in the Indian Ocean world, and specifically in India. And he will pass away about a quarter of a century into the 17th century. So that's sort of an overview of who he is, and I think that he challenges many of our notions of Africans as victims, oftentimes portrayed, or of European or other imperial forces. And he's just an exemplar of somebody who, although enslaved himself, rises to extraordinary power, and it just shows the African genius and African sort of resilience and contributions in the shaping of the larger Indian Ocean world. So those are some of the things that I would highlight about his life.
Okay. So You mentioned when he got to India that he worked under or his new master was also an African, was also Ethiopian. Um, and in the book, he also mentioned that they were not the only two Africans around, that there were
That's right.
thousands and thousands. And this was new to me when I found it. And I think it's not common knowledge to most people. So
Right.
maybe can you share us about that? Why were there so many Africans and Ethiopians in India at that time? What was the relationship between the two countries, or how are they linked? If you can share some of that.
It's a great question. So I think if we pan out, we have to understand the Indian Ocean world as an area that has a natural flow of people and products and ideas moving around, at least going back to the first century Common Era. The first documentary source that shows connections between East Africa and India is something called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is a Greek source which looks at basically the trade routes. And it was designed, actually, the source for people who wanted to know about the different ports of trade in that world. And so we know there was trade going on between East Africa and Gujarat on the west coast of India, going back at least to the first century Common Era. So, 1,500 years before Malik Ambar, there is ongoing trade between these regions, which is facilitated by the monsoons, which are cyclical or seasonal ocean and wind currents, which again almost serve as a conveyor belt. For about 4 months, they move one way and then slow down and stop for about 4 months and then reverse course. So you have this easy flow of people and products and ideas, as I mentioned. So specifically, Malik Ambar joins what is really a part of a military slave system. So Africans were regarded as some of the best warriors and were often brought into armies as mercenary soldiers or as slave soldiers. And slavery in this period of time looks very different from what we imagine in the Atlantic world, where slaves could rise to significant positions of power. And so we know that for at least a century and a half, 2 centuries before Malik Ambar is alive and traveling across this vast ocean world, there were other Abyssinians that were making their way both on their own volition, that is, as traders themselves, as sailors, as explorers. Africans have long been exploring the world within Africa, but also in other parts. And so he was part of that mix of people who were, again, on a combination on their own volition, and they're also enslaved and taken to India. And he was part of that military slave system. And by the time that Malik Ambar is born, really Muslims are largely in control of the sea routes in this area. So he's entering into a Muslim political sort of domain. But his armies are made up of Hindu, Maratha soldiers, cavalry soldiers. So it's a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious environment in which he's entering. And I think that goes against a lot of how we understand history, which is we think of people being sort of locked into their various areas and that they don't move. But long before the modern era, people were moving around and mixing it up. And so that's a little bit why he's there and why many other Abyssinians are there as well.
So you mentioned that one of his biggest legacies was fending off the Mughal invasion from the Deccan.
Yes.
And you briefly touched on who the Mughals were and who the Deccanis are, but can you tell us more about what is the major conflict between those two forces? Because now today when we think of India as like, oh, it's India. They're both Indians. Yeah. What's the conflict?
Right.
But how was it then? What was the difference?
Yeah. I mean, it's mostly about just political power and gaining more resources. So within the Deccan, which is the sort of central part of India, you had the formation of multiple sultanates. And a sultanate is basically a kingdom that is ruled by a Muslim political authority. And after the dissolution of what was called the Bahmani kingdom, there were basically 5 different sultanates that were created, and the one in which he enters is called the Sultanate of Ahmednagar. And so he is one of these sultanates which regard themselves as really free of this Mughal imperial rule. So the Mughals were also Muslim imperialists, and they were ruling the northern part, and they were making a push to try to take over more and more of the land in the central part of India to have more resources. And so it was just an imperial force from the north versus sort of a conglomeration of kingdoms, all Muslim, as I mentioned, with a significant Hindu population. But in the mix were also Christian merchants, and there were Jains and other traditions, Buddhists in these areas. So it wasn't a religious conflict. It was really about politics and economic gain. And so that was what was happening between the Deccanis and the Mughals in the north. And Malik served to keep basically the Deccani forces together. And interestingly, they would fight against each other intermittently as well. So he was constantly having to look over his shoulder to make sure that, they could try to unite as much as possible when the Mughals were trying to come in. And they tried to come in multiple times.
Okay. So I have 2 topics that I would love if you dived into. Maybe we could start with, because you mentioned in your book that the Mughals were considerably a much larger force than the Deccanis.
Yes.
Even all the Deccani different sultans together were still smaller than the Mughals. So what did Malik Ambar do that was different, that made it so successful against this large imposing army?
Right. Well, it's sort of a David versus Goliath kind of a situation where, I think that Malik was extremely astute, and knowing the limitations that he is dealing with, that he engaged in something called Barigiri, which was basically these fast sort of guerrilla warfare strikes using the Maratha cavalry. But he was in some ways a master of basically repelling, but then pulling back and then allowing for some land to be gained temporarily, and then attacking and then pulling out, so that he was always keeping the Mughals, whenever they were making incursions into the Deccan, unstable. And so he himself had been inspired by a woman who he followed. Her name was Chand Bibi, who was the regent minister of 2 kingdoms, actually, of Bijapur and also of Ahmednagar for a time. And he was under her command for a time as one of her generals. There's a famous scene where she's fending off the Mughals. They're actually in a siege. They're in a fort. And Malik Ambar is actually in the forest, and she's inside inside this fortress, and the Mughals are pounding at them with and cannon. And there's a breach, and Chand Bibi famously sort of grabs some armor, puts it on her. She takes off her veil, puts on her armor, and attacks the hole. And then her bodyguards and the people around her actually join her, and they're able to temporarily repel the Mughals, but ultimately will be conquered. But the key thing is that he had witnessed this kind of courage and fierce independence, and had been inspired by her. And he was attacking the Mughals from the outside, their supply lines, as this was happening. So it was sort of knowing that you're smaller, but you just have to be smart about how you deploy your military forces. So the guerrilla warfare called Barigiri, which he employed in combination with really diplomatic skill building, diplomatic sort of alliance making, I should say, with the other rulers in the area. And he was a really extraordinary administrator, and he was able to, in some ways, win over the people to the extent that a ruler could win over people, giving them more, in some ways, ownership of their own land and more access to their own resources that they were growing, as opposed to taxing them, to death in some cases. So, the Mughals themselves actually had wonderful things to say about Malik Ambar. And at some point, I would love to read what what one of the Mughal chroniclers talks about upon Malik Ambar's passing away. So whenever you like me to read that, I'm more than happy to. I'm queued up here.
Please, if you're ready, we'd love to hear it.
Well, thank you. Part of what I did in this book is I got the last sort of sections are primary sources. So where I got the information to construct this biography based on previous biographies that were written by South Asian scholars, but that were much more focused on the military history. I brought out more of the social history and also more of a reconstruction of his early East African life. But this is something that the Mughal court chronicler Muhammad Khan says upon his death in 1627. So this is again a Mughal chronicler, right? So he's writing about the Mughal enemy, and he writes about Malik Ambar upon his passing away: in warfare, in command, in sound judgment, and in administration, he had no rival or equal. He kept down the turbulent spirits, maintained his exalted position to the end of his life, and closed his career in honor. And then he says, history records no other instance of an Abyssinian slave arriving at such eminence. Those are powerful words. So this comes from a Mughal chronicler about Malik Ambar. So imagine if your enemy is talking about you that way, what kind of reputation do you have among your own people? So I think that bodes well for Malik Ambar as an important figure in this era.
That's a quote. It also makes me want to ask, do we have any sources of Malik's own writing about himself?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is no. What we do is we have a lot of people who've written about him, from Mughal court chroniclers to Dutch and Italian merchants and travelers. We have Maratha records about him. One of the people that would be inspired ultimately by Malik Ambar's independence, who himself was inspired by Chand Bibi's fierce independence, was Shivaji, who was the grandson of one of Malik Ambar's generals. And Shivaji would become known as one of the great Indian Hindu resistance and independence leaders. So he has an influence among different groups of people. And so as a result of that, we are able to construct or reconstruct his life. But unfortunately, there's no archive of his own sources talking about his own life. Maybe there was one. It may have existed, but it doesn't exist today. And that makes us wonder, like, how many other people of such extraordinary lives do we not know about, or do we not know enough about? I think about the global African diaspora, and I think about people like Queen Nzinga from the area of Angola, or Bencos Bioho in Colombia, or even Anthony, quote, the Negro in the Chesapeake in North America. There's so many stories of Africans of just extraordinary capacities and leadership in their respective areas, and the contributions to world history, not just African and African diasporic, but those things are inextricably connected to world history. So it does give you pause.
Yeah. So I'm going to pause as we're going to end. By the way, I'm doing the next episode is on Queen Nzinga. I reached out. I reached out to. There's a new book, a recent book. It's called Nzinga of Angola. I'm blanking on the author's name.
Linda Haywood.
Linda Haywood, yes. I reached out to Dr. Haywood online. I haven't heard back yet, but good. Hopefully she responds.
Yeah.
So,
just to say something about that, I actually had an article published in the journal, the academic journal called 16th Century or 17th Century. And in it, they actually have a photo of me performing with my students this famous scene where Queen Nzinga is basically not given the respect to have a seat. You may have known about this. And so I perform, her attendant gets on all fours on the ground, and Queen Nzinga sits on me so that she can then be eye to eye with the Portuguese official. But they actually that's actually a published photo. I'll try to send it to you.
Oh, awesome! I would love to see that.
Yeah.
Before we go, because almost I'm thinking we can wrap up at 10 before 2.
Yeah,
That's okay with
sounds
you.
great.
So maybe we can end with, you mentioned a lot about Malik Ambar's legacy to the point where even his enemies can't talk bad about him. I think that says a lot about his character. So maybe the last questions could be, so what happens to that Indian-African connection? Where does that world go? How does it vanish to the point where I know people in Ethiopia here don't know much about it? And while I was researching Ambar through different social medias or message boards, I reached out to not Indian scholars, but to Indians who would be willing to talk to me. And as far as I can tell, even the comments on the Malik Ambar video that was published, many Indians, this isn't really taught in schools. Like many Indians are also unaware of this past. So what happened to that world?
That's a very good question, Adam. So I think what happens, the short answer is that the racism that comes with European imperialism and the transatlantic slave trade, which essentially codifies racial slavery and the justification for the notion of racial inferiority of Africans and people of African descent, is grafted onto the Indian Ocean world by British but other forces. And it's not to say that there wasn't racism in the Indian Ocean world or that there isn't racism in other parts of the world prior to Europeans. Race is a social construction, as we know, but based on power, and race looks different in different parts of the world. How people categorize each other looks different over time. Even in North America during the early 19th century, what it meant to be black changed from one southern state to the next, whether one was 132nd black or 1/16th of African descent or what have you. It looked different. So even in the same general area during the same time, race looks different. So the notion of African inferiority becomes tied as a result of European colonial and imperial success and transporting this racialist ideology into the Indian Ocean world, and then becoming institutionalized in the educational systems that are spread throughout different parts of Africa and India. And so I think a lot of this, the memories among ordinary people of African greatness in India is lost. And one also has to acknowledge that there wasn't, not everybody could be a Malik Ambar. Not everybody rose to such eminence, but there were these distinctly African, that is phenotypically black people who were considered nobles in India for a period of at least 200, almost 300 years. And so their descendants would in some ways bear the burden of racism in its Europeanized dominated form. And so a lot of communities that were on grounds that were built by Malik Ambar and other Abyssinians would slowly lose their control over those property and become marginalized. One of the great things that we had as a result of the United Nations Declaration of the Decade of People of African Descent was an exhibit that I helped to produce in its earliest form, which was online, called Africans in the Indian Ocean World, through the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture as part of the New York Public Library. It's an internet exhibit right now. But there was a physical exhibit that my colleague from there, Dr. Sylvia Diouf, a brilliant historian, and Dr. Kenneth Robbins, who does really art history as a collector, did, which looks at African elites. And it was a traveling exhibit that was in Delhi and other places. And it continues to travel the world. It's a sort of a UNESCO-supported project. So the education continues through mediums such as yours, Humble History, through the books, but also through exhibits and what's available online. But I think that the answer to your question of why is it that Malik Ambar isn't so widely known is a function of racism in its Europeanized form. And that's, I think, the best answer I can give you as far as I can tell.
Thank you for sharing that. I think our time is running out.
Okay.
So I'll leave the last word up to you. Whatever you want to share, whatever message you want to put out there. This is your platform, and thank you for sharing.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Adam, for inviting me onto your episode. I really am honored to be part of what you're building here and helping to educate fellow Africans, but also just people from all over the world and across the African diaspora about the richness of African history and African diasporic history as part of world history. These things should not be separated. They're part and parcel. I think one of the things I think is important is that we continue to educate each other, but to also continue to really support the voices of others who are trying to do this kind of work. And just to shout out to my colleagues as part of the Ethiopian and East African Studies Project at UNC, University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and other scholars, students, people who are just generally interested in this. Out there who are trying to learn more, and that we should stay in touch with each other, keep feeding each other, books and sites and videos to keep educating each other. Because I think the more that we're grounded in this history, the better we can sort of grow off of it. I think that in some ways we know that with children, when they know who their families are and some of their history, they grow up healthier. And I think at a moment like this, where we have a global pandemic, we want to be grounded in our histories and look to each other for support. And we know that that COVID-19 here in the United States is disproportionately affecting Black communities, which tend to be poorer than many of the other communities. And so we want to be attentive to Black history, whether it's in America or in India or in Ethiopia, to better respond and do something positive in response to what has been happening now and historically speaking, and to point to those extraordinary examples of the Malik Ambars or the Adam or the Haywans or the others that are part of all of our collective history, right? So with that, thank you so much, and wishing you best in your future episodes.
Thank you very much for those kind words. And I want a big thank you to you as well, to the professors who do the research. For someone like me who could just, I read historians, you are the historian. So I really want to thank you for doing this interview with me and for Humble History, but also just doing your wonderful profession, a fantastic job for all of humanity. I really appreciate it. So for anyone who's listening and who wants to get a copy of the book, we will link an Amazon link in the description, so you can just click it and you can buy your own copy directly. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. It was the main source I used for the previous video that we did for Malik Ambar. A link for that will also be here if you want to look at that as well. And once again, in closing, thank you very much, Dr. Ali, for taking the time to speak with us. And I hope you stay, and I hope we can talk again soon. I hope you stay safe during this time.
Would love that. Yeah. All right. Be well. Take care, Adam.